I'm starting with an explanation. The Hebrew word for widow connotes one who is silent, one unable to speak. In a society in which males played the public role and in which women did not speak on their own behalf, the position of widow, particularly if an eldest son was not yet married, was one of extreme vulnerability. If there were no sons, a widow might return to her paternal family if that recourse were available. Younger widows were often considered a potential danger to the community and urged to remarry. Left out of the prospect of inheritance by Hebrew law, widows became the stereotypical symbol of the exploited and oppressed. Old Testament criticism of the harsh treatment of these women is prevalent. So are the texts in which they are under the special protection of God. In our reading from Acts this week, we hear, all the townswomen who had been widowed stood beside Peter weeping and showing him the various garments Dorcas had made when she was still with them. And I have to admit something. I've read this passage many times, and every time I saw the widows as showing off Tabitha or Dorcas's impressive needlework, and I thought it was sort of a strange detail, and I otherwise ignored it. My heart must be in a different place this week, because this time when I read it, I thought, oh my gosh, she literally clothed the widows. The women were showing Peter her good works that had blessed their lives as proof to him that she was worthy of his healing. Which, of course, makes far more sense. And most of you probably noticed it ages ago, but I'm slow. And I try to admit it because the Bible is dense and none of us can make sense of it all at once. There's another detail to know about this story, an important one. Not only is Tabitha named in this story, which is pretty unusual for biblical women, she's named twice, which is even less usual, but the big thing is she's called a disciple. And if you're wondering how unusual that is, let me answer with a scholarly quote. Luke uses the feminine form for disciple, the only time it is used in the New Testament. This is the only woman in the Bible to be called a disciple of Jesus, and she is one who is described as someone who never tired of doing kind things or giving to charity, at whose death the people who are the most exploited and oppressed gather, grieving and trying to prove her worth by showing the gifts she had made them. I am incredibly moved by the example of the first woman disciple. Here's the thing about Tabitha. Her story suggests that as a follower of Jesus, she spent her life making things easier for the most vulnerable people around her. But not just by giving them things, but also by loving them. Because I don't think that the level of grief we hear from the women who had been widowed in this story reflects a fear that new clothes are going to be harder to come by. I think their friend who saw them and eased their burdens had died. Tabitha heard their voices and used her life to respond to their needs. Where the Bible talks about God's special protection for the widows, it seems that Tabitha was part of God's work. A disciple of Jesus, a little Christ indeed. In John, the voice of Jesus says, "My sheep hear my voice. I know them and they follow me." And it is clear in this story in Acts that Tabitha knew the voice of Jesus and followed and set an example for those of us who come after her. Now, widowhood today is not what it was then. Today's widows may well be struggling with economic hardship, but the first connotation of widow is now someone who has lost her love instead of someone who has lost her livelihood and protection. which means that when we are trying to consider who the stereotypical symbol of the exploited and oppressed are in our society, I don't think it defaults to widows anymore. Nor actually do I think there is one simple answer. I fear that who is seen as the stereotypical symbol of the exploited and oppressed is impacted by context and perception and political party, as well as all of our other opinions. Meaning, I would likely start the list with trans women of color, most likely to be murdered, and could continue from there to form an expansive list. After this week, I'm concerned that in addition to the highest levels of the list of After this week, I'm concerned that in addition to the highest levels of the list of stereotypical symbol of exploited and oppressed is going to need to be anyone capable of becoming pregnant who doesn't want to be pregnant. Because it seems that our society is about to declare that people who become pregnant stop having authority over their own bodies. Happy Mother's Day. You want to know what else is really interesting about Tabitha? Besides that we get 2 names for her and she's called a disciple and she's known for her good works. In addition to all that, neither her marital nor social status is mentioned. She's known for her works and they eclipse the question of who she belongs to. Which, to be fair, was a sort of kingdom-building equity the early church was going for, but it's still always notable when it happens. And it seems notable that the widows were named as believers. They were not recipients of charity, nor just friends of a disciple. They too were the church. This was a church of everyone, even those whose names implied the silenced. It seems like Tabitha's church had stayed very close to the roots of the Jesus movement. The question of who is particularly vulnerable, exploited, oppressed is really a question of who would Jesus be hanging out with? And to his credit, Jesus took a really expansive view of that as well, including fishermen and tax collectors, widows and single women, children and senators, adulterers and the mentally ill, hemorrhaging women and those with physical disabilities. Several years ago, when I was nearing time to go to camp, I had to let someone know I wouldn't be available for some meeting during camp. This was not a person in this church or community. The person responded, "Oh, that's right. You go to camp and work with people with special needs. That's so good of you." And I am still mad, furious. Going to camp is the most selfish thing I do all year. I go to camp because I love the campers. I go to camp because I love camp. I go to camp because my humanity and faith are restored by camp and the campers. I'm not a good person for that. And to imply that I am implies that there is something wrong with the campers, and there is nothing wrong with the campers. Everything is right with the campers. But it makes me wonder a bit. I think likely Tabitha and the widows of her community were friends, real friends, people who loved each other and mutually gained from their connections. I wonder if a question we should be asking in response to Tabitha's story is, who do I find it easy to love and grow with? And how can I let that love expand my heart to let even more people in? And I admit I worry that this question might be too small. It could keep us closed off or too limited to those we already know. But then I remember, what love is like and how everyone has stories that matter and everyone has experiences of oppression and how love just likes to expand itself all over the place. And then I find I am ready to trust love to be our guide. I believe our faith calls us to see the humanity in all people, including those who are oppressed. and to share our love and lives with mutuality and respect, and to be open to letting that love expand to those we don't know yet, who have struggles we don't yet understand. Let love be our guide. Let it expand in us. I believe that's what it means to follow Jesus' voice and Tabitha's example. So may God help us do it. Amen.